What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burtnett. In today's episode, I'm going to be bringing you a breakdown of my thoughts on really my rankings of the top 10 teams in college football right now, giving some thoughts on a couple of teams that are just outside, and then breaking down my kind of system for why I ranked these teams in the order that I did. But if you go on to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date. But without further ado, let's dive in to the midseason college football talk rankings. So getting started, I wanted to kind of go over the criteria that I'm going to be ranking 7 teams that really stand out. And there's an 8th undefeated team, but I don't think they quite are up there with these other 7 teams. North Carolina is the team that's on the outside of the AP top 10 right now. And the Tar Heels have a really solid team. Obviously, you got Drake May at quarterback really leading the way for the offense. Their defense is helping to get the job done, and they are sitting 6-0 undefeated. And they've looked pretty good right now so far this season. You know, they have wins over a Miami team that was reeling from a bad loss, over a Syracuse team that started the season well. They've kind of dropped off pretty big time recently. It's kind of been a theme of theirs recently in Syracuse. But North Carolina is just outside kind of this upper echelon of teams. A couple of other teams that are just on the outside looking in. Oregon State, they are going to have the ultimate test to end their season. They have one loss. If they can get through the slate up into these 2 games, which are against Washington and against Oregon, if they can get into that slate with one loss, it's two game season for them then. You know, it's preparing for both of those 2 games with a chance, you know, maybe just needing to beat one of them to reach the Pac-12 championship game. And then you've got Ole Miss as well, also on the outside looking in. They'll have a tough test against the AP number 1 Georgia Bulldogs on November 11th. The Rebels have a very high-powered offense and have tested teams. You know, they have lost to Alabama. It's not a bad loss by any stretch. And then a couple of other teams, Utah, they have, I would say, probably an even tougher stretch coming up here soon. At USC, home against Oregon, and at Washington. I think those are 3 out of 4 weeks. I think they have a game against Arizona State in there as well. But the Utes have continued, even with all the injuries that they're facing, as a team, and especially to Cam Rising, the quarterback. The Utes defense especially has been leading the way, forcing turnovers, and has them in a spot with just one loss that they can potentially still make some noise in the Pac-12. And for them, it'll come down to beating those teams. USC obviously looks a lot more beatable after the way they have looked throughout the season, and the way that it kind of really showed with, I think, 5 turnovers against Notre Dame. And Notre Dame is another team. They're at 15 with 2 losses. They're probably out of the picture, especially the way that Louisville lost to Pitt this past week. But their other loss is still a very good loss to Ohio State. And so then here's the 3 outside of this top 7 of undefeated teams that I'm going to go in a little bit more in depth on. Alabama, I have at 10. They have a good loss to Texas, a couple of good wins. I say a good loss to Texas. I don't think it's a great loss. It was at home. They took the lead in the 3rd quarter, but they got pretty much handled in the 4th quarter, ended up losing by double digits at home. I think maybe a touchdown difference would have been a better indicator of how that game went. Again, it's a very slight difference, touchdown to 10 points. But Crimson Tide have turned things around. Jalen Milroe at quarterback's playing a lot better. And they have a good defense. The most they've allowed in a game is 34 points to those Longhorns. And every other game besides that, they haven't allowed more than 21 points. They let Arkansas make things really stressful, I guess, at the end of this past Saturday. But overall, the Crimson Tide are definitely a top 10 team. And really, they probably have a pretty clear path to the SEC championship game. They get Tennessee at home this weekend, bye week, then LSU. So if they win those 2 games, and effectively they're into the SEC championship game, and they would definitely have a shot at the playoff. Oregon, 5-1. They don't have the resume of the team that's ahead of them, which is Texas, but they have a good, very, very good loss to Washington, because obviously this past Saturday came down to a field goal attempt to tie the game and send it to overtime. I mean, really just an incredible battle in Seattle between the 2 teams. You know, rivalry game days there, top 10 matchup really for the lead lead pole position in the Pac-12, but I do think there is a strong likelihood that the Ducks and Huskies meet again in the Pac-12 championship game. And if they come out on the other side in that one, I think Oregon is a lock for the playoffs, assuming they don't slip up before then. Then Texas at number 8. They have a clear path, I would say even clearer than Oregon and Alabama. Their opponents that are left the rest of the way are combined 22-17, so pretty middle of the road slate. I again think they have a better win than the Ducks, winning at Bryant-Denny Stadium, and also a Kansas team that is 5-2 and is also a good win. So those are my teams that are outside the 7, and those 7 teams that I'm going to be giving my thoughts on what separates them. Honestly, between these 7 teams, I spent really the last couple of days or so off and on just breaking down each of these teams, kind of looking at them in a number of different ways. But those teams being, I think the order that I'm going to give here is maybe, from 7 to 1, how the AP has them. Penn State, Oklahoma, Florida State, Washington, Ohio State, Michigan, Georgia. So those are being the 7 teams. And what I did with each of these 7 teams is I kind of gave different categories. I kind of did the eye test, just like immediate thoughts. I think I put this together on like Sunday morning. So pretty much as soon as those games were done from the past week, how are these teams looking right now? Who do I think is the best team? So that's the first category. And then I also broke it down by stats, and the key stats that I took were offensive yards per game and points per game. You got to be able to move the ball, and you got to be able to score. Obviously, those are very important. So then on the flip side of that, defensive yards allowed per game and points allowed per game. You've got to be able to limit opposing offenses, and you've obviously, most importantly, got to keep points off the board. So I ranked teams by that. And then 2 other categories I actually took from defense, because I think offense kind of tells the tale, and one of these areas regards forcing turnovers. It's sacks and interceptions. I think sacks are obviously important because you're getting pressure. Sometimes QB pressures can be an accurate indicator, but I think it is important to be able to actually get home. And then interceptions as well, to be able to shift that momentum, to be able to pick off the opposing quarterback regardless of how good he is a very important stat as well. And so that's one of the other. I have 5 kind of key categories, and with those stats, I ranked the teams on like an average of where they ranked, again, just compared to each other, those 7 teams, where they ranked in that. And it kind of came up with something surprising. Penn State and Oklahoma are actually the top 2 teams in that. Penn State, offensively, not great. They're 6th in yards per game, but they're 2nd in points per game. So they're kind of, you average those out kind of middle of the road. They move the ball. They don't move the ball great. They don't put up a lot of yards. But I think what their defense does, and it shows, 1st in yards per game allowed on defense, 2nd in points per game, 1st in sacks, and then 5th in interceptions. So it shows that they're really winning the field position battle, because while they aren't putting up as many yards as, say, even in Oklahoma or Georgia, who are 3rd and 2nd, obviously Washington is way above everybody else, Penn State shows that they can get the job done on defense, and they can score when they need to, and they can put up a lot of points at that. And Oklahoma kind of similarly, they're number 1 in interceptions, 4th in sacks among these teams, 5th in points per game allowed, and 5th in yards per game allowed. So defensively, they're making the big plays, but maybe consistency is a little bit more, shaky, wobbly, being able to consistently get it done. But then offense, they're number 1 in points per game and number 3 in yards per game. So that was kind of my surprising things of stats. Point differential is obviously huge as well. It factors in, I think this one balances pretty well with strength of schedule, because the lower your strength of schedule is, the more you'd expect the correlation for your point differential to be higher. So a team like Michigan, for example, with the highest point differential in the country of 32.7 plus 32.7 points, also has the 5th strength of schedule out of these teams. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy there, perhaps. Penn State, similarly, they have the number 2 point differential in the country and out of these teams, 32.4, but their strength of schedule ranks 6th among these teams. Oklahoma, they really, when I was going over these things, eye test, I had them at like 6. Eye test was pretty similar to the AP poll. I think I had a couple little adjustments here and there, but Oklahoma is third out of these teams in point differential, and they're among the best in the country as well. I think they're either third, right behind Penn State, or maybe fourth, 31.2. And their strength of schedule is second out of these teams, and it was probably top, I think it was top 20 strength of schedule in the country, maybe top 30, somewhere around there. And so the Sooners as well really kind of surprised me, and you'll see when I have revealed kind of this top 7 in a few minutes here, why the Sooners are as high as they are. And even when it comes down, another category that I did, point differential the rest of the way after Michigan, Penn State, and Oklahoma, is Ohio State, Florida State, Georgia, and Washington. Again, Washington, they have the lowest point differential, but they have the strongest strength of schedule, so that kind of balances it out. It shows that they've had the toughest schedule out of these 7 teams, and so it kind of explains why you'd like to see yourself maybe a little bit higher in comparison to these teams, but I think the Huskies have proven that they're able to get the job done, and their last 2 games have really been what has brought down that point differential. 7-point win over Arizona, who's looking very good after a win over Washington State, and then obviously the 3-point win over Oregon, who I think is definitely still a top 10 team. And so that's the other thing, point differential. Georgia's is low, and they when I was putting this together, really, you have to be cognizant of that. You're not just putting the Dogs up there just because they're back-to-back national champions. This team has had their struggles this year, and it might only get tougher in these next few weeks as they deal with 4 to 6 weeks without just the otherworldly tight end Brock Bowers, as he's out with an injury. I think he maybe had that tightrope surgery. Without Brock Bowers, the Dogs could be in for a little bit of, a potential upset here or there. So something to keep an eye on, because they're 6th in point differential among these teams, but they're 7th in strength of schedule. They have the weakest schedule out of these 7 teams, and yet they're 6th in point differential. They're 4th in the stats, so they're pretty kind of middle of the road among these teams. And obviously, when I'm talking about these teams as well, they are the top 7 teams in college football. So, you're comparing, the thinnest of margins between these teams, but you do have to separate. I mean, it's not like you can rank all of these teams at number 1 and have a tie. I also talked about strength of schedule. The final thing that I kind of factored in is the best wins, and what I factored in, because this is a midseason look, this is full resume and how our team's performing right now. And how does their schedule kind of match up in a broader picture? And so I looked at best wins, factoring in, most importantly, wins over teams that are currently in the top 25, because a team like Georgia beat a Kentucky team that wound up then getting just beat down by Missouri. And so that win doesn't look nearly as good for the Bulldogs. It was a good win when they did it, but another factor to consider. Washington, I think, has the best win over Oregon. OU is very, very close, if not even, with Washington in terms of having the best win over Texas in the Cotton Bowl. Ohio State is 3rd with that win over Notre Dame. Notre Dame, the way they controlled USC, proves that they're still in that top, half of the top 25. And then Florida State also beating LSU, who's starting to kind of turn a corner after a couple of losses, and Clemson, who's receiving votes. And then Penn State, a 31-0 shutout of Iowa, who just beat Wisconsin. The Hawkeyes have looked better. And the shutout might not be as impressive. I mean, it's always tough to shut out a team, an FBS team, especially a Power 5 team. But I think the points is what really is impressive, too, putting up 31 against the Hawkeyes. So without further ado, kind of blabbered on a little bit here, but here is the top 7 in descending order, so going from 7 to number 1. At number 7, I have Florida State. They have good wins, again, over LSU and Clemson, but they've had a couple of close calls, especially one against Boston College on the road, that an Eagles team that isn't up there. That's not a game that you want to really be playing with your food too much, so to speak. You want to be able to get the job done. Number 6 is Penn State. They, as I mentioned earlier, have the best stats. They're the most well-rounded when it comes to offense, defense, forcing turnovers, and getting sacks. They're a great team, but I do feel like outside of that Iowa game, they just haven't been tested yet. And this is a prove-it week when they go into Columbus. If they get a win, I would strongly consider bumping Penn State all the way up potentially to number 2 or 3. because they would have that kind of prove it week. And here's where I could hear a lot if this video gets a decent amount of views and picks up at all in Georgia. I have Georgia at number 5 and probably in a tie with the number 4 team. They're still the back-to-back national champions, so they deserve all the respect, and honestly maybe should be a little bit higher. But this is an entirely new season. I'm looking at this from a season perspective, and I think the Bulldogs just haven't really always looked the part of being back-to-back national champions this year. On one side, they're getting the job done. They're getting wins. That's the most important thing at the end of the day. But on the other, they have the weakest strength of schedule among these teams. They have the second worst point differential out of these teams. And again, it's separating the best of the best. But I do think among these teams, Georgia, they will get into the playoff, and they probably, AP college football playoff rankings, they'll probably be number 1 the whole way as long as they win out. But from what I've seen this season, I would have them at 5 or maybe in a tie with number 4, which is Ohio State. They've had slow starts. They've looked better, especially having several guys out on offense, several starters against Purdue. They completely dismantled the Boilermakers and really did so from the start. So that was kind of a fix from maybe some things that they've been dealing with early in the season. Oklahoma I have at 3. I think they've been the most balanced team, and that shows in the stats, that shows in the point differential, that shows in their win, and it shows in the strength of schedule. All of those are in either second or third among these teams in each of those areas. Again, the areas that I rank these teams by. So the Sooners, I think, are deserving of being that number 3 team, and really the only test they have, I think, is at Kansas in a couple of weeks on the 28th. Aside from that, they should go right into that Big 12 championship game, likely facing Texas again. And if they win that, they're a staple lock Sharpie for the college football playoff. At number 2, I have Washington. They have the Heisman frontrunner, Michael Penix Jr., who had a huge game against the Ducks, even while battling, what were fairly obvious, maybe not injuries, but definitely was hit pretty hard in that game and was definitely battling through that. They have the most electric offense. They have the best offense statistically in the country, I think maybe behind Oregon. And they get the win. They get a huge win. I would say it's between them and Oklahoma. It's probably pretty even, but I would say arguably they have the best win. And so the Washington Huskies I have at number 2. And finally, from hearing the other 6, the number 1 team in the country, I really do think is the Michigan Wolverines. And I know there's a hesitation to do this a little bit because the strength of schedule that they have is 5th out of these teams, and they don't have a signature win. They have a couple of good road wins where they completely took apart Nebraska and Minnesota, and they've dominated every team that they play, really. They've had a little bit of, really the only game that I would say is like shaky start to finish was Bowling Green, but they still won that one by 25. And so I think they are the most consistent team. They obviously, I would say, have the best defense. Them and Penn State, probably Penn State very close behind them, but I think Michigan has the best defense. They've been the most consistent. Even when McCarthy throws 3 interceptions in that game against Bowling Green, they still go on to win. And, they got a running back like Blake Corum. They've got a secondary led by Mike Sainristil, who has, I think, a pick 6, one of 3 for the Wolverines this year. So the defense is creating points. The offense is pretty smoothly moving the ball down the field and scoring when they have the ball. And so it's tough as a kid who was born and raised in Ohio to put the Wolverines at number 1 in the country. But I do think that Michigan is the best team in the country. But let me know your thoughts on my rankings. Let me know your thoughts on what you think the order should be. And maybe if you think North Carolina is deserving of being in front of any of these teams, or maybe one of those one-loss teams. But if you enjoyed this video, again, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date. Thank you so much for watching College Football Talk. I'm Peter Burtnett, signing out. Peace.